As Trinbagonians, we tend to think of ourselves as a fun-loving, friendly, truly blessed group of people. God is a Trinidadian. Carnival is we ting. There's no such thing as a bad time to fet. We do have a serious side though, a somewhat violent side. One of the darkest moments in Trinidad history happened on the 23rd of March 1903. If you don't know why this date is so important, maybe it's because it was before your time, but this is the date of the Water Riots of 1903. And it was a violent affair that was given another name, Mournful Monday. When the dust cleared, the body count was high, 18 dead and 42 wounded. But how did this happen? The source of contention was government's intention to install water meters to measure water use in homes and business places in Port of Spain. A necessary move because some of the rich tended to take long, luxurious baths to stave off the sweltering tropical heat. Water was a luxury in Port of Spain, and the wasting of water in Port of Spain and environs was wanton. In some cases, taps were never turned off. Some were kept running to fill huge plunge baths that held as much as 1,000 to 2,000 gallons of water. Not surprisingly, government also proposed visiting residents to search for leaking pipes. Any offenders would have their water supply shut off. The bill was met with such opposition from the public, who in turn placed the blame right back at government, saying they were among the chief wasters of water in the capital city. But the water meters and the shutting off of leaky pipes was the surface issue. The real heart of the matter was the lack of representation for the people in matters of governance. In 1899, the elected borough council, based in Port of Spain, had been suspended. 2 years later, the Ratepayers Association was formed to agitate for its reinstatement. The group was ostensibly formed to protest rising taxes in the capital city. It was a militant group of mostly middle and upper class members who were seeking more representation and a significantly less patronizing form of governance. And it was this group that led the protests against the new water ordinance in 1903. The actions of the Ratepayers Association forced the postponement of the water ordinance 3 times. Once in 1902, then again in February 1903, and then yet again on the 16th of March 1903. To the credit of the Ratepayers Association, they managed to garner the support of the lower classes in their efforts. Maybe because one of their most prominent members was Emmanuel Mazumbo Lazar, the former head of the Pan-African Association and a well-known black lawyer. Whatever their methods, the Ratepayers Association was successful in getting its message to the people, quite unlike the elitist, high-handed approach of the government. On the day in question, the Legislative Council met at noon in the Red House. Attendance was restricted to those who had admission tickets. In fact, a notice was published in the Port of Spain Gazette of the previous Friday, clearly stating the rules of attendance. And this rule was enforced by guards armed with batons positioned at all entrances of the Red House. But they expected that attendance would be high because an extra 150 chairs were rented for the chamber. By noon, the room was partially full, mostly with government officials. It was even alleged that the majority of the tickets were given to government officials to limit public access. Outside the Red House, a large crowd had formed in Brunswick Square, now known as Woodford Square. Many filled Abercrombie Street and spilled into parts of St. Vincent Street as well. The Ratepayers Committee was out in full force, leading the crowd to the building's entrance, demanding entry. Naturally, they were blocked by the police. The committee members moved to the front of the crowd and asked for permission to enter the chamber. Lieutenant Colonel Blake repeated his orders, adding that he was under special permission by the governor to match with equal force any attempt to enter the meeting chamber illegally. Of course, some members tried to test the intent of the officers and tried to press through, dramatically keeping their arms raised as if to reassure the officers that they meant no harm, and they were pushed back into the crowd for their efforts. Emmanuel Lazar saw what was happening, and he begged the crowd to remain calm and to return to the square and await the results of the meeting in a peaceful manner. And so they did, but perhaps not as peacefully as the security forces would have liked. And a rumor that a fire brigade had been instructed to turn their hoses on them did little to calm the crowd. But it wasn't a rumor. Fortunately for the crowd, Lieutenant Whiteman, the senior fire officer on the scene, refused to do so, saying he was in the business of outing fires, not wetting crowds. Perhaps he was following the lead of his superior, Chief Fire Officer Walter Riots, who was decidedly reluctant to have his officers present at the Red House. Some say his reluctance was based on his sympathies to the cause of the people, who after being turned away from the council chambers were making a lot of noise in Brunswick Square. The crowd grew restless and began to sing loudly in the square, and several stood up to deliver angry protest speeches against the governor, the bill draftsman, the bill itself, and any and everything related to the water bill and the government. His Excellency the Governor Sir Alfred C. Maloney arrived with his private secretary under police guard. He went to his office in the Red House, where 35 armed constables had been stationed for his protection, and there he met the Colonial Secretary and Captain Dutton. It was an amazing show of force. From there, he proceeded to the council chamber for the meeting of the Legislative Council. 10 more armed police officers entered and took up position inside the meeting chamber. The meeting could now begin. The clerk rose to read the minutes of the last meeting, but he wasn't allowed to get very far because Sir Henry Alfred, a leading colored barrister at the time, interrupted him. Sir Henry was upset about the ticket system imposed by the governor, which he felt was illegal, and pointed to Standing Order 4, which clearly states that all meetings of the Legislative Council should be made public. It was his opinion that the ticket system contradicted that standing order. The barrister then moved a motion to adjourn the meeting. But a fourth adjournment was not in the cards, and Sir Henry's vote was shot down 14-6. Sir Henry Alcazar then blasted his council members for supporting an illegal meeting.
I, for one, am not staying in any chamber if the people of this country have to get tickets to see their representatives at work. I'm not supporting that.
And left the council chambers in disgust. Sir Henry's outburst and sudden departure placed the governor in an uncomfortable position. Fortunately for him, the remaining members seemed to disagree with Sir Henry's assertion. But for the record, he had to justify the admission via ticket for this meeting of the Legislative Council. But his reasoning didn't meet the favor of Council Member Gordon, who also left the chamber saying he could not be party to a grouping whose rules could be changed at the whims and fancies of the governor. The remaining members took a moment to reflect on what had just happened, and then the clerk finished his reading of the minutes of the previous meeting. His Excellency the Governor then rose and gave a history of the bill to the council. As though on cue, the crowds outside grew more rowdy, the mood degenerating to carnival-like atmosphere.
Look, Alcazar coming! He'll tell us what's going on inside of that house.
Honorable people, ladies and gentlemen, please listen. I just walked out of the Legislative Council chamber. Listen, they are insisting that only ticket holders will be allowed inside the public gallery, and they are not accepting a proposal to move an adjournment of the House.
Drums were beaten and whistles were blown, creating a rhythm for some women to conduct with their flags. Yet despite the seemingly festive atmosphere, the mood around the Red House soon turned sinister. Some say a woman threw a stone, breaking a window to the council chamber. A woman was arrested on the lawn of the Red House for reasons that are still unclear. The arresting officer then became the target of a group of small boys who attacked him with a barrage of stones. The poor officer was forced to release the woman, who then attacked him mercilessly until the crowd had to come to his rescue and drag her away. But the attack of a police officer was the last straw. The crowd focused their anger on the Red House, aiming a barrage of stones at its glass windows and doors. The missiles entered the council chamber, forcing members under tables and chairs to hide. The crowd, drunk with power, moved in on the building, and their rage spread to the gathering on the west of the building, and they too joined in the action. With the building under attack from both sides, the council members had to move to the inner chambers of the Red House. Eventually, the crowd broke the gates on the east and west of the building, overpowering the police guard. Someone suggested that His Excellency the Governor announce to the crowd that he withdrew the ordinance. But Sir Alfred was defiant, insisting that the ordinance must remain. With him in the small room were some members of the press, Major Collins and some others. They attempted to barricade the door to block the rioters from entering. The crowd had a special dislike for one council member in particular, the Director of Public Works, Mr. Walter Wrightson, the author of the dreaded Water Ordinance. It was obvious that he had to escape or the consequences would be severe, and that he did. Now, some accounts say he dressed in women's clothes to elude the rioters' attention. Others say he was dressed in a police tunic and helmet, but he managed to escape. The Attorney General escaped in a similar fashion. As for the group barricaded in the small abandoned office upstairs, it seemed that freedom would elude them. But a fire started simultaneously in the survey office, the Hall of Justice, and the Registrar's office. The fire spread rapidly through the building. The governor and his companions were hastened out of the Red House. His Excellency was rushed under police guard to the barracks across the street. Mr. Walter Wrightson was smuggled to the wharf and transported to the HMS Palace for safekeeping. The police, energized by the reading of the Riot Act, made moves to quell the crowd by any means necessary. And so they did. Even though their first shots had restored the crowd's senses, the officers continued shooting. Some of the officers fired indiscriminately into the crowd, injuring many, including innocent bystanders who were nowhere near the heart of the unrest. When the police weren't shooting at the crowd, they were using bayonets on their victims. When the shooting stopped, 18 were dead. 42 others were injured in the melee and sought treatment at the Colonial Hospital. Only a shell of the Red House remained after the fire. The building was completely ravaged. After such a bloody affair, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, appointed special commissioners to investigate the cause of the riot. The sitting was held the following evening at the Prince's Building near the Queen's Park, Savannah. Appearing for the government were the Attorney General, the Honorable Vincent Brown, Mr. R.S. Ausher Warner, and Mr. Louis A. Wharton. The Ratepayers Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the United Committee, and the relatives of the deceased were represented by Sir Henry Alcazar, the first man to storm out of the ill-fated meeting of the Legislative Council. After a little over a month of investigations and in-depth interviews, the special commissioners sent out their report on the Water Riots, dated the 2nd of July, to the Colonial Office. They found that the riot was caused by public opposition to the Water Ordinance, and their anger was fueled by some public speakers on the day and the Mirror newspaper. The report said that the police used unnecessary force to quell the crowd. Close to 500 rounds of ammunition were fired. At least 3 people were killed without provocation. Surely, one of the innocent victims was a young girl named Eliza Bunting, who had been bayoneted in the abdomen. Another innocent victim was Eva Cavallo, who was killed by her former lover, Police Sergeant Thomas Holder, who used the cover of the riot to meet her in Brunswick Square and shoot her at point-blank range. Or at least that's the official account of her death. This particular incident, the murder of Miss Cavallo in the middle of the riots, inspired many a tale from those who wanted to speculate on the story behind her unfortunate death. And this being Trinidad, the theories are endless. Her former lover, the spurned Sergeant Holder, well, he was fortunate and was found not guilty in his trial. The Special Commissioner's report also placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the government, saying they failed to inform the public adequately about the water ordinance and didn't do enough to correct any misinformation about it. The report made note of the separation between the actual residents of Port of Spain and the executive committee mandated to manage their affairs. It criticized the delay in prosecuting rioters and the wanton display of violence by officers of the law. Later that very month, the trial of the rioters began. 22 people were tried for rioting. The case started promptly at 10:30 on the 21st of July 1903 in Greyfriars Hall on Frederick Street. Presiding over the proceedings was Justice Routledge under an extraordinarily heavy show of security. The police officers on duty were supported by 26 rank-and-file officers of the Lancashire Fusiliers. They were on loan to the governor from Barbados and had been stationed in Trinidad since the Wednesday after the riots. The security measures weren't missed and created a bit of a stir. But considering who were on trial and why, maybe it should have been expected. The Attorney General, the Honorable Vincent Brown, King's Counsel, naturally led the prosecution's team. He was joined by L.E. Agostini and L.A. Wharton, with assistance from A.D. O'Connor. The trial lasted 1 week. The verdict was ready by 4:40 in the afternoon of the 30th. The large security force got into position, just in case another disturbance broke out. By this time, a large crowd had gathered outside the courtroom. After further instructions, Judge Routledge sent the jury back to deliberate. At 7:15, the jury returned to the courtroom and announced that 9 of the prisoners were innocent of all charges. However, they were unable to come to a unanimous guilty verdict. So the judge released the innocent to the crowds, who welcomed them as heroes and sent the jury back to make the remaining judgments. They returned to the courtroom at 9 that evening with a guilty verdict for 5 of the prisoners: Joseph James, Lila Assing, Octave Romain, and Johnny Blades were all sentenced to 5 years in jail. Abraham James was sentenced to 4 years. Similarly, the 4 people charged with inciting the riot, J.C. Mares-Smith, H.N. Hall, E.M. Lazar, and R.R. Mole, were eventually acquitted of all charges. The disaster of the water riots led to the creation of a board made of official and unofficial personnel to manage the water and sewerage system. The Water and Sewerage Board was first convened on the 30th of September 1904. A special commissioner's report was merely a slap on the wrist for the guilty parties involved in the bloody water riots. Fortunately, Secretary of State Chamberlain understood the message behind the report and advised Governor Maloney to initiate talks to reinstate the suspended Borough Council. 10 years after the water riots, an elected council was created, finally allowing locals the opportunity to represent the interests of their peers. Mournful Monday led the path to the establishment of a more representative form of governance in the Twin Islands of Trinidad and Tobago.